The 20th, Lenz walked through the mountains. Snow on the peaks and upper slopes, gray rock down into the valleys, swatches of green, boulders and firs. It's 1839, and a 21-year-old Georg Büchner is writing a novella called Lenz. This scene, a guy walking through nature, perhaps seeking the sublime, in 1839 is hackneyed, typical. The Romantics are doing just this, walking through nature looking for a connection. That is, until, like the 1988 translator Henry Rappolt says, comes a sentence like a blow. This sentence is what some critics say ushered in the period of modern literature. And it is the same sentence that led me into a years-long love affair with this same novella. It states, "He felt no fatigue, except sometimes it annoyed him that he could not walk on his head." Today, in this video, I want to show you how Georg Büchner's Lenz is a genius meditation on the boundaries, nature, and pitfalls of intersubjectivity. I want to show you how Büchner uses narrative structure to both replicate Lenz's psychological disintegration and increasing alienation from the world around him and the people around him, and break and chip away at that same alienation by way of form and this novella's existence as a text. I am Gabriela de Mendonça Gomes, and this is a life of reading. Behind the novella Lenz are three important historical figures. In addition to giving you that background, I'm also going to give you a short summary, as well as my personal context with how I encountered Lenz and fell in love with it. Number 1, Lenz. Lenz is an eponymous protagonist. That means that the story is written about him and it has his name. Jakob Michael Reinhold Lenz was an 18th century writer who was a contemporary of Johann Goethe. Goethe actually made quite a bit of fun of Lenz, and they were at court together, and it was a little bit sad. Goethe was a little bit mean. But Lenz began his theological studies at Königsberg when he was about university age, but he gave up those studies to become a writer. He was mostly a writer of dramas, and his more famous works are The Tutor and The Soldiers. But when he was 26 in 1777, he was staying with his friend and fellow author Christoph Kaufmann, and Lenz suffered a mental schism. Some critics like to say this or that. I personally don't think that we should take the diagnosis one way or another. I think that the most important thing that you need to know about this mental schism is that Lenz started hearing voices. So, in hopes of affecting his improvement, Kaufmann sends Lenz to the backcountry to stay with this particular pastor Oberlin, Johann Friedrich Oberlin, who had helped people in the past and was a guidance person and very nice. And Lenz stays with him from January 20th to February 8th of that year. He unfortunately doesn't get better. He only gets worse, and it eventually gets him sent away from the parsonage where he was staying. After he leaves, or maybe around the time when he's there, Oberlin writes a text Kafkaesquely titled Mr. L. A century later, we get Georg Büchner. Büchner is a kind of like the Keats of German writing, perhaps. He was an essayist, a scientist, a brother to the famous physician Ludwig Büchner. By the way, I know Büchner is a very Americanized pronunciation of Büchner's name. Büchner discovers Mr. L, and he reads a little bit of Lenz's writing, and he thinks that him and Lenz are kindred spirits. We know this from his letters, and he decides, I'm going to write something about Lenz. So he's writing Lenz around the same time he's writing other things like Leonce and Leona, or Wojciech, or Danton's death. He dies of typhoid at 23 before he gets to finish writing Lenz. And we know from his letters to his friends that his intention for writing Lenz kind of varied. Maybe it was an essay, maybe it was going to be a play, maybe it was going to be a novella. And so Lenz is this fragment that we have. So let's talk about the novella's narrative structure. Lenz is a patchwork of vocal fragments. Büchner takes stuff from the account of Mr. L and doesn't change things and doesn't attribute things, which we could go into a plagiarism argument, but that's honestly an aside from now. Most of the time, the narration comes from this third-person omniscient narrator, which reports the things external to Lenz, like in the first sentence, but also his mental state and his interiority, like the sentence we read about him feeling no fatigue. It moves between free indirect discourse, direct discourse, and also just general narration. And if you don't know what those terms mean, we're going to get to an illustrative example in just a little bit. So the narrator is interpreting Lenz's interiority as well as discussing the things external to it. And here are the most interesting things that are happening within the novella's narrative structure. In Mr. L, Lenz's dialogue is always in quotation marks, of course. But in Lenz, Lenz's voice is never in quotation marks. Even when it says something like, he says, Lenz's voice exists on the same narrative plane as the narrator. So we have character Oberlin, narrator Oberlin, character Lenz, narrator Lenz, and then narrator above all of this. And Büchner will throw in a sentence from Oberlin's text in this first-person perspective, verbatim, without a clear attribution, which is highly, highly fascinating, and one of the reasons why I love this novella. So the events in Lenz mostly parallel Mr. L, but Büchner adds in some events and takes away some things. And so what I'm going to summarize right now is what happens in Lenz, not in Mr. L. And if you get this edition, the one translated by Richard Seaberth, which is the one I recommend, then you will get both Mr. L and Lenz, and a piece from Goethe which mentions Lenz in the same edition. And what I love about this edition is that there is the German on one side and the English on the other, so you can compare them side by side. I have 2 copies, I actually have 3, but my third one is at my mom's house. What happens in Lenz? I personally don't care about spoilers. If you do, or you already know the context, skip ahead to here. So it opens with Lenz walking through the mountains. He has this experience. He goes to the parsonage. He feels fine. Then he's alone and he starts freaking out again because everything feels unreal. He can't tell where he ends and the world around him begins. And he jumps into the fountain from the 2nd floor and starts bathing and making this ruckus, and he gets really embarrassed, and the people are like, what's happening? They're kind of freaked out by him. And then the next day he goes into the woods again, and he hears a voice which inspires him to give a sermon. Oberlin's a pastor, remember. Oberlin says, yes, you can give a sermon. Büchner doesn't tell us what Lenz says in the sermon, neither does Oberlin. Oberlin just says it's a pretty sermon from the pulpit. But what Büchner does give us is Lenz's interiority. He feels both totally connected to the people around him, to the people singing and, chanting and being in the church, but also then he feels totally unreal, and then we get, again, this scene of unity and alienation at the same time. Then his friend Kaufmann, who sends him to the parsonage, comes, and they have this Kunstgespräch, and it's the part that most critics discuss, and it's where Lenz gives his strongest criticisms against idealism and romanticism, the main movements of the time. And Kaufmann says, Lenz, maybe you should go home. And Lenz goes, go home? I'd go crazy, I'd freak out. He gets really upset, he runs into nature again because he can't deal with Kaufmann and Oberlin. And he runs into a shepherd's hut, and in this shepherd's hut he finds a child that is dying. And the scene is a beautiful, crazy scene where there's so many voices and singing and it's chaotic. And Lenz is so sad that this girl is dying. And he thinks that he can kind of enact a Lazarus story. And so he grabs her hand and he prays, and then he goes, awaken and rise. And of course it doesn't happen. Then he comes to the realization that there either is no God or there is a God, and that God doesn't care about him. And that atheistic realization is what brings Lenz to his most ultimate mental rupture, at which point he attempts to take his life a couple of times, and Oberlin and the people at the parsonage say, "We can't really handle him anymore," and then they send him home. And the novella ends with the sentence, "And so he lived on." How did I find Lenz, and why do I love it? When I was in high school, I did a summer course at Cornell, and it was called Madness and Genius in Literature. We read Thomas Mann, we read Goethe, we read Diderot, we read Balzac, and we read Büchner, we read Lenz. Cornell has this really beautiful library, and I was reading the book there on my own, and I came across that astonishing sentence, and I literally gasped aloud. And I got the dirtiest looks from the people around me, and I felt really badly, but I was so shocked at this line because we had just read The Sorrows of Young Werther, and Werther is very similar to Lenz in a lot of ways. You know, he's this kind of like whiny guy in nature. So that's what I was expecting. And then all my expectations were literally and figuratively ruptured and flipped on their head. So I wrote an essay about it called Lenz's Intrinsic Motivation. Then it's my senior year of college, and I have to choose what I'm going to do, spend a year studying for my honors thesis. And I loved Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, I loved Clarice Lispector, and I loved Lenz, and a number of other works. I was thinking, maybe I'll compare As I Lay Dying and Lenz. And one of my beloved professors, the one who was running the thesis seminar that year, said, "Are you sure you want to compare two books?" So I chose Lenz. The argument that we're going to go into today is very similar to the argument I made in my thesis, but my thesis, I couched it in historical stakes, arguing that Lenz was an anti-romantic and or proto-modernistic text because of the way it treated this approach to transcendental experience. I argue that instead of celebrating this experience of transcendence, it causally connected the desire for transcendence with a hostile fragmentation of consciousness. My thesis was called The Voices Awakened on the Rocks, an explication of polyphony and peculiar consciousness in Georg Büchner's Lenz. So today we're going to unpack how is it that Büchner tells the story of a man who cannot reach beyond the confines of his own consciousness while still creating an intersubjective experience between the reader, writer, and protagonist. But first, let's talk about madness. Whether or not the condition that the novella describes is a type of madness is something it both tries to elucidate and complicate. In Mr. L, although Oberlin is very kind, he foregrounds Lenz's madness by calling him an unfortunate patient in its last line. In Madness and Civilization, Michel Foucault defines madness as a set of beliefs and behaviors that deviate from the standards constructed by historical social formations. He claims that the mad constitute a credible challenge to normality, and as a result, typically experience social alienation. Lenz anticipates that criticism because the novella forces into question whether what Lenz is experiencing is actually mad or whether that is something that the characters merely perceive it to be. Only appearing as madness demonstrates that the text uses the interplay of narrative voices to both recreate and represent the state of Lenz's consciousness as seen by him and by others, while using that same textual phenomenon to illustrate the complex nature of intersubjective conscious experience. Descartes famously said, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. But Lenz complicates that claim. How do I know it is I who is doing the thinking? How do I know it is my voice with which I think? And that brings us to the voice. The voice is a force that both elucidates and obscures consciousness when it links the intangible human internality, how I feel inside, my thoughts, my feelings, to the external world, as well as to the other subject with internality. But the voice is not just something that communicates something else. It's not just a vehicle for meaning. It's a vehicle for self-consciousness and self-presence. In Voice and Phenomenon, Jacques Derrida argues that the essence of language is its telos, its aim. And the telos, or the aim, is voluntary consciousness, as wanting to say, a vouloir dire. So in both the desire and the act of saying something, I am asserting my self-presence and my self-consciousness. The voice, as an object of experience, is the carrier of linguistic meaning, which translates the wanting to say into the saying. And so Derrida argues that consciousness manifests itself as being within the voice because the voice is the only thing that allows us to acknowledge our self-presence. While every time I say something, I am inserting and asserting myself into this moment, I am acknowledging the self as something that exists here in this moment, it is also acknowledging the other. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argues that the voice possesses an immediate moral authority that calls both acting parties, listener and speaker, into action. And that's because every time I'm saying something, I'm saying it to a listener, be that listener myself or somebody else or just the general world. On top of that, the other is always already present in every linguistic utterance. What I mean is that since the first linguistic utterance, since the first time anyone has ever said anything, we are speaking in a tongue given to us by some collective other whose entirety is never fully knowable. We are, in linguistics, tracing back to Proto-Indo-European and other means of investigating archaeologically, anthropologically, and linguistically the origins of the English language and other languages. But we can never exactly know where those shifts are coming in and where things change and where it all really began. So, as Mladen Dolar, a Slovenian philosopher, argues, the moment that the voice comes into being, the moment the sound of my voice hits your ears, it becomes autonomous, deferred, and part of the other. Underlying every single thing we will ever say is some weird soup of me and you, of self and other, that we can't really tell where one thing begins and where one ends. Critic Vincent Pecora argues that at the very heart of our being, there is a voice that speaks and cannot be located, that is there and not there. Self-consciousness and self-understanding depend on both language and the voice for its articulation. But we know that language is unstable, and now we know that the utterance and the voice is a mixture of self and other. So the very act that brings us into being, that makes us relational beings, is precarious. And Georg Büchner's Lenz dramatizes what happens when those ontological premises are pushed to their extremes. Now we're going to get into some close reading. In The Meridian, poet Paul Celan argues that, as one who walks on his head, Lenz experiences the heavens as an abyss below him, and as a result, the world as one that is no longer whole, stable, or certain. After that famous line, things start ramping up. At first, he felt a tightening in his chest when the rocks skittered away. The gray woods below him shook, and the fog now engulfed the shapes. Now half revealed their powerful limbs. Things were building up inside him. He was searching for something, as if for lost dreams, but was finding nothing. Everything seemed so small, so near, so wet. He would have liked to set the earth down behind a stove. He could not grasp why it took so much time to clamber down a slope to reach a distant point. He was convinced he could cover it all with a pair of strides. That last line demonstrates Lenz's confused notion of his relationship as a physical being in an embodied space. Although intersubjectivity is about the relationship and connection and interaction between minds, it always happens in a particularly embodied instance. For example, let's say you're talking to your friend or your parent or your partner, and you're both in the same room. Then you or they leave, and now either your conversation has to end or you have to speak more loudly. This interaction, whatever you were talking about, changes based on the embodiment. And your experience of yourself and the other always happens in a particular body within a particular embodied context within a particular environment. Lenz clearly doesn't understand the relationship between his consciousness and his embodiment. He feels that he can put the whole world behind a stove and that he should be able to cross the field in the mountains in a pair of strides. We know that that's not realistic, and those boundaries grow increasingly obscure. Soon after, Lenz hears the voices awaken on the rocks. And this is the first instance that we get of Lenz hearing a voice in nature. And things just go downhill from there. What follows is a 25-line sentence that starts with only sometimes when and moves over 30 clauses until it finds its adverbial predicate, Lenz, and he would feel something tearing at his chest. He would stand there, gasping, body bent forward, eyes and mouth open wide. He was convinced he should draw the storm into himself, contain everything within himself. He stretched out and lay over the earth. He burrowed into the universe. It was a pleasure that gave him pain. Or he would remain still and lay his head upon the moss and half close his eyes, and then everything receded from him. The earth withdrew from him. It became as tiny as a wandering star and dipped into a rushing stream whose clear waters flowed beneath him. This very long and jagged sentence illustrates the first instance where Lenz is really losing the boundaries of himself, his first true dissociative episode in the novella, and it happens like on the second page. The ambiguous word choice of something in the first sentence there, when he would feel something tearing at his chest, is important. Something in the original German translation is S, which most closely resembles it, but it also could just mean something. And the fact that he can't identify that something means that it could be his emotions tugging at his chest. Maybe it's the wind physically tugging at him, or maybe it is he himself who is tearing at himself. And those equally plausible possibilities show us that Lenz does not understand in this moment what is happening to him from things external to him and what is happening to him from things internally. This ontological confusion, this confusion of what is his being, is also reflected in the fact that he wants to open his physical parts up. He wants to open his eyes and mouth wide and take the storm into himself. We can experience the sublime and maybe take it with us as a memory or as an emotion, but we cannot physically take it within us. So we are again seeing that the Lenz doesn't really understand where he begins or ends and where the external world begins or ends. And linking form and content, this is a 25-line sentence that contains many beings within it, sentences, in one long run-on space, and I would say mirrors Lenz's ontologically blurred sense of self. The sentence also gives us a very clear example of Büchner's complex narrative structure and how it interweaves voices. It becomes pretty blurred pretty quickly, so I'm going to try to parse it out as clearly as possible to show you why things are so complicated. We have the narrator describing how Lenz feels invisible forces tearing at his chest. This clause of this sentence is an example of indirect discourse. Narration is what's happening on the page. When there's dialogue, then there are quotation marks. Sometimes we have ways of expressing interiority without using dialogue. So, for example, he says Lenz feels that something was tearing at his chest. Or you can say, she wondered about what was going to happen tomorrow. Just a random example. That verb, that reporting verb, tells us that we're inside a character's mind. He feels, he wonders, he concludes, he ponders, whatever. So we have a narrator inside a character's mind, but we can tell that the narrator is there. But then, within the same sentence, the narration states, he burrowed into the universe. It was a pleasure that gave him pain. This is arguably an instance of free indirect discourse. So now we had what we just had, which is indirect discourse, but we have that adjective free in front of it. It's a different literary term. Free indirect discourse goes into a character's mind without telling us that it is doing it. So instead of using a reporting verb, for example, instead of saying he feels it was a pleasure that gave him pain, We don't have that. We just have that statement of Lenz's interiority without saying that we are reporting that. Okay? So we have narration, we have free indirect discourse, and we have direct discourse, all happening in the same sentence, which is utter chaos. So that infuses Lenz's internal voice with that of the narrator. And then, two more fascinating layers of complexity here. We are using these interthreaded narrative voices to learn about the phenomenological voices, or the voices that Lenz is hearing in nature, that make him lose his sense of self. So, many voices are describing an instance of someone experiencing many voices and not being able to tell what voice comes from where. And on top of that, this is all happening within our minds as readers, which adds another voice and interiority into the already complex mix of those things, which is genius. There's also a really interesting thing happening with the verb tenses in this sentence. While before, when we start the novella, the 20th Lenz walked through the mountains, we have this past simple tense of just ed verbs, but this sentence uses a subjunctive would. It says he would feel something tearing at his chest, and he would remain still. And that would intimates or suggests some kind of repetition, some cyclicity, which fragments our position temporally. Why is this happening? Why is this phrase as if it was something that happened over and over again when we know that this is illustrating a particular instance? Or is it? That's the thing. We don't know. That ambiguity. We don't know how many times Lenz has gone through this. And the subjunctive use would suggest that this is perhaps not the first time, nor will it be the last, which is true. Yet it exists again within the same sentence as the past simple tense, which confuses us of what's happening. And Büchner's genius lies in his perfect presentation of this paradox of consciousness and intersubjectivity. Can we genuinely ever inhabit the consciousness of another person? Can art do that? Is that what mediates our understanding of ourself and others? Or does an irreducible otherness always remain? In The World as Will and Representation, pessimistic philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer claims that humans unavoidably create a violent clash between our desires and abilities, precisely because of the fact that we are always projecting our thoughts, feelings, desires, and categories onto the world and the people around us. That not only does violence onto the thing onto which we are projecting, but also onto the self. And as a result, life is suffering. Happiness for Schopenhauer doesn't really exist as its own positive thing. It's only the deprivation of suffering, which we understand as happiness. But despite the fact that Schopenhauer believes that humans are anguished products of our own epistemological making, fated to conflict with others and with ourselves, he did say that aesthetic mediation or meditation is the only thing that allows us to be suspended from our will. Encountering another's consciousness through their art relieves us of the burden of our own. But there is an incommensurable abyss that we must overcome, or perhaps reside in, as we come into the space of intersubjectivity. Because every act of communication forms a bridge between our internal worlds and that of someone else's within a shared physical or psychological space. Lenz explores what happens when, as Nietzsche famously warns, if you gaze for long enough into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. Employing these ideas from Schopenhauer and Weil, and you could say Nietzsche as well, Irish-British philosopher Iris Murdoch discusses how the great task of morality is not actually making better moral actions. It's about learning to stop projecting our own fantasies onto the world. Weil says that absolute attention, unmediated attention, is love, and it is prayer, and it is faith. Art's function, according to Murdoch and Weil and Schopenhauer, is To interrupt this is to encounter another person's depictions, another person's minds, and it's a means of coming face to face with another consciousness that resists our personal categorizations. Lenz is a work that defies categories. Is it fact or fiction? What genre is it? Who is the narrator? And what is the function of narration? Is its protagonist mad? Engaging with it allows us to engage with this moral task. It also uniquely allows us to engage with an instantiation of intersubjectivity with a mind that resists that exact premise of a shared world. Or perhaps of a mind that simply just doesn't configure it in the same way. A mind with a deteriorating understanding of what belongs to it and what doesn't belong to it, what arises from within itself and from without itself. The pinnacle of Lenz's crisis, the one that causes him to try to take his own life, is one that makes him hear silence as a hideous screaming across the entire horizon. For Lenz, silence is not an absence of sound that creates space for new interactions and utterances. It's an overwhelmingly oppressive and infinite presence. In its absence, it is fully, relentlessly present. And the presence of silence emphasizes the end or the lack of a possibility for intersubjectivity. It emphasizes no others with whom he can connect. And if Lenz can hear nothing but silence screaming, he cannot escape the confines of his own mind and come to hear anything beyond his own projections. He is stuck in a Schopenhauerian state of suffering without the possibility of escape. Carl Jung perfectly conveys the nature of Lenz's existential solitude. Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself, or from holding certain views that others find inadmissible. After Lenz has this ultimate mental break, he returns to Oberlin's parsonage and can only communicate himself in what is described in Büchner's Lenz as, quote, broken words. Much to the other inhabitants' discomfort, he begins his nightly bathing again. And then the mood in the house is tense, and one night, quote, the maids who slept in the children's room beneath him said they had often, and especially that very night, heard a deep humming noise that they could only compare to the sound of a shepherd's pipe. That comes from Büchner's version. In Oberlin's version, that same sentence appears, but instead of comparing Lenz's voice to a shepherd's pipe, Oberlin describes it as a demon. In both instances, Lenz's voice is compared to something non-human. But in Büchner's, it's still a pastoral instrument of something that can bring beauty or truth or something or art into the world. Whereas in Oberlin's, it is a demon. It is a voice that comes from some ungodly place. That is a big difference. And then comes the fascinating sentence I mentioned much earlier in the video of that interpolation of Oberlin's voice into Büchner's Lenz, which is, perhaps it was him moaning in his hollow, ghastly, desperate voice. This phrase is interesting for so many reasons. In Oberlin's narrative, it's interesting because that perhaps, saying perhaps it was him, shows that either Oberlin thinks that maybe Lenz is being inhabited by some kind of demonic force. Perhaps it was Lenz, perhaps it wasn't, perhaps it was something within Lenz, or that perhaps it wasn't, maybe that it was some other demonic, spiritual being. And then in Büchner's Lenz, it's very interesting because there's no attribution who notices or observes this particular thing. So this voice kind of comes out of nowhere, and it could be that it is this narrator of whom we know nothing about because it's this omniscient third-person narrator that kind of floats around. And I think that this sentence encapsulates the paradox of consciousness. The paradox of consciousness is what we've talked about before, is that in order to know that I am, in order to know that I am conscious, I have to also be aware of the other, or of the endings of myself, because if everything is self, then nothing is self. The boundaries of a certain thing are defined by that which is not. However, while self is not other, at the same time, as we've spoken about in the level of language, the other is always already present in the self. It's always a part of the self. And this paradox explodes the binary of self and other by asserting the existence of both sides simultaneously. Lenz is a dramatization of this paradox because he hears voices whose origins seem indeterminable to him. He cannot find the boundaries that define his self from that of others. Things are always melting into this indecipherable puddle. This realization leads him towards a spiritual and mental state that doesn't feel comfortable existing within the confines of the typical social and psychological construction of the world and the role of the self within it. This state is what is considered madness by some. But the reality is that perhaps none of us can truly tell where this self of ours begins or ends, and the others whose influences have built what we've come to understand as ourself begin. Buddhism speaks of interbeing and interdependence as parts of our natural human states, as something that is essential to our being. But the Western world and the modern cultures that have developed have really emphasized individualistic reality and individualism, a reaffirmation of the ego rather than a dissolution of it. We see ourselves typically in the Western world as an independent agent with private thoughts, personal values, distinct desires, an isolated ego. Carl Jung did posit in the West that there is a deep layer of psyche beneath the personal unconscious held by all of humanity, the collective unconscious, which generates symbols and instincts and structural patterns that shape human existence beyond the immediate ego. Literature acts as a space of active interaction between minds where we can stage intersubjectivity most truly. And in Lenz, it allows a reader to build a bridge with the consciousness of a person whose bridges to the external world are themselves collapsing. In St. Augustine's Confession, he writes, "A human is such an abyss. Every art or everything created by a human, then, is a reflection of some facet of this abyss." Any text is an abyss, and Lenz is a particularly poignant one. Büchner's employment of a multivocal narrative structure to recount the speculative biography of Lenz can perhaps be read as a return to the original meaning of text, which comes from texere, to braid, to weave, or to fabricate. In Mr. L., Oberlin tells his story of Lenz. Büchner uses the interwoven narrative voices to recreate Lenz's state of consciousness, but in turn reveals something deeper and more deeply true about the nature of human consciousness, its multiplicity, its complexity, its dependence on others and intersubjectivity, and simultaneous requirement of a knowledge of self. Perhaps to study text is to strive to understand the origins and the patterns and the interstices of these threads that create ourselves in our worlds. And the voice, in its written and oral mediums, provides a wonderful avenue of this study in Lenz because of its similarly ambiguous nature and origins. In turn, readers can see the multiplicity inherent to text, to tradition, to individual and collective consciousness, and that, perhaps, to walk on one's head is to see the true nature of things. So, read on. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for working through this text with me and thinking through it with me. If you haven't read it yet, I would recommend you do, and recommend it to everyone else as well. Please let me know if you're interested in another video about Lenz, comparing Lenz and Augustine, or anything else, if you'd like a deeper dive. As always, there's a companion essay for this video and all my other videos. A Life of Reading is expanding. The new website, alifeofreading.org, is now the permanent home of my project. It's where you can find links to my videos, which will still, of course, be on YouTube, companion essays, which were previously on Substack, reading lists, and information about an incredibly exciting project, my new upcoming project, the book club. and everything else organized in one place. I'm dedicating Substack to publishing creative writing, creative and critical nonfiction, and perhaps I'll even become daring enough to put my fiction and poetry there. Paid subscribers will receive a new original essay each week, with one of those essays becoming available to all subscribers each month. Now, Patreon. This is going to be the upcoming home of the book club. Beginning in November, we're going to read major works of Anglophone, Lusophone, and other traditions of literature together in guided cycles. Members will receive a structured reading schedule like a syllabus, questions and supplementary materials, short lectures, and larger lectures, as well as live discussions weekly. Those discussions will also be recorded for those who can't attend weekly. There will also be smaller seminars and independent study options for readers who want more. My hope is that these platforms provide different ways of building a genuine life of reading, be it watching, reading, or joining the conversation yourself, which I very much hope you will. Everything is linked below, and I'll be sharing much more about our first book and the November launch very soon. Kisses. Thank you, and read on.